if you are black or brown in a community that is already seeing that policing is already unfair, seeing that policing is already bypassing all your rights, standing outside your home in a group could be considered gang activity,
right?
Illegal activity. So no, people don't actually feel safer. People feel more scared.
Right. We know many of these laws come from the black codes and the vagrancy laws that were part of the Jim Crow.
Yeah.
And when folks say make America great again, oftentimes they're referring to this era where you could police bodies for just standing on the corner, or black people had to have permission to walk around.
Right.
And so even after the end of slavery, things like that were still happening. Hi, and welcome to the Know Your Rights Camp podcast. My name is Amir.
And I'm Dee.
And today we're focusing on a really pressing and current issue with what the impact of the Trump aftermath and the Trump election means for black and brown communities.
We're going to be breaking it down into two main topics. One, so-called law and order, and two, immigration.
And although he's just taken office, President Trump has come in guns blazing with many executive orders governing similarly to his last term, where he passed different orders, and a lot of them undoing the previous administration, and a lot of impactful things that have directly impacted community the following day. And today we're going to dive into some of those executive orders and actions.
So what are these second-term policies? Essentially, Donald Trump is focusing on intensifying punitive measures. He wants harsher sentencing, expanded use of the death penalty, broader criminalization of even the smallest crimes. And he really risks exacerbating mass incarceration even further. And he, like you said, he's reversing any sort of progress that may have been made in the past couple of years, which is saying a lot considering that 2020 is not that long ago.
Exactly. I mean, some of these policies are going back into the Middle Ages almost.
Right. And I don't think people realize that there's a side effect. I think people, when they hear harsher policing, those who may not quite understand what that means thinks, oh, well, there's a lot of crime out there anyway. But what's interesting is that we're actually seeing less crime. And so there is no need to increase policing. There is no need to double down on law and order, other than the fact that a lot of folks who are in Donald Trump's administration, they use fear to control the masses, and law and order tends to be a good tactic for those in power.
Right, exactly. And we know the consequence of these policies. When we see overcrowded prisons, as we've seen here in California, to the point where it's unconstitutional to have so many people in. And when you have these harsher penalties, and we know that community programs and supports and investments are what actually help and resolve issues, as opposed to criminalizing or being, quote unquote, tough on crime.
Right. And I think that's the focus that those who want to respond to the way Donald Trump and his administration is going about this is, if they're going to be using carceral measures, what can community folks do? What can we do to sort of actually try to fix the issues that are leading to crime?
Right. And we see that. And I mean, looking at the death penalty specifically, where they estimate 1 out of every 9 people executed actually could be found innocent if further exploring the evidence and different things. And then also, states with death penalties don't have lower crime rates, actually. So it's not a deterrent of crime. But Trump's rescinding Biden's executive order and immediately reimposing the federal death penalty will definitely have consequences.
And it's scary because I read that during Trump's last administration, that was the most amount of people on death row that we've actually executed.
Right.
No pardons, no nothing, no attempts to actually reinvestigate any crimes where there were any questions. And it's scary to think that if that's what they've done before, in this administration, where it seems like there's a lot more support behind these carceral efforts, it seems like it'll be even more devastating to communities, especially communities of black and brown people.
Exactly. And the pardons that are coming from this administration relate to things related to a potential coup that happened in this country, where there were actual casualties and people died as a result of this, but yet 1,500 people were pardoned to excuse what is one of the darkest days of history in this country. So it's tough on crime, but what type of crime?
Right. And not only that, the way that they're pushing for this sort of tough on crime policy is really draconian and totalitarian. And it's scary because you use the phrase law and order, but a much more important phrase in this country, or so we thought, was due process. And so the way they're trying to push for more incarceration, for greater criminalization, is to completely bypass people's rights. No due process, guilty until found innocent, but probably, convicted before that could even be found out. And it's scary to think that this is something that we're seeing in our communities. And a lot of people ask, does this actually make people feel safer? And I read a study that said people don't feel safer because, for example, if you are Black or brown in a community that is already seeing that policing is already unfair, seeing that policing is already bypassing all your rights, standing outside your home in a group could be considered gang activity, illegal activity. So no, people don't actually feel safer. People feel more scared.
Right. We know many of these laws come from the black codes and the vagrancy laws that were part of the Jim Crow. And when folks say make America great again, oftentimes they're referring to this era where you could police bodies for just standing on the corner, or black people had to have permission to walk around. And even after the end of slavery, things like that were still happening. And another area of this tough on crime, law and order impacts relates to protest rights too. It's very related. And we saw during the last Trump administration, many unconstitutional violations of the people's rights, crack down on protests, attempts to use military and National Guards and other means to clamp down on American rights of free speech.
And as they're doing that, they're protecting police.
Right.
We spent a lot of time pointing out all of the police abuse, but this is going to give further protection to abusive police. And when it comes to protest rights and First Amendment rights, I do believe Donald Trump was the one who condoned the use of force, even deadly force, against protesters.
Right.
And I think he described it as, quote unquote, a beautiful thing to watch. And if that's the person sitting in the Oval Office, from the top down, we're really going to have a lot of work to do. So what is that work that we do?
Right.
What is the call to action?
Exactly. As our federal government seems less protective and actually more abusive, it's up to states, it's up to localities, it's up to cities and governments to pass laws that can help protect citizens. And gratefully, we're seeing that in certain cities. Like, I like how the mayor of Newark, Mayor Ras Baraka, was speaking out against the ICE raids that happened there. During the first week of Trump's, presidency in the second term, he broke a record with almost 1,000 people, over 1,000 people being, detained by ICE. And that's a record even for him. And in Newark, New Jersey, there were some really egregious situations where the mayor had to put out a press release and say, this is not how we want our citizens treated. They did a roundup that also got, people who had their American citizenship. So they're just rounding up everyone. Even in the Navajo Nation, it happened where 15 members of the Navajo Nation were rounded up in ICE immigration raids. And these are, indigenous American people who ancestors have been here for centuries, now being detained. So we're going to see more of that, unfortunately, but it takes local governments, cities, nations, Navajo nations, and different indigenous nations to speak up and draw a line in the sand to not allow these federal abuses.
Yeah. And, luckily, there are a lot of groups, there are a lot of activists, attorneys, community organizers that are doing their best right now, right, to sort of pick up or do the job that the government is supposed to be doing. You're seeing mutual aid become a phrase that people are finally understanding.
Right.
Understanding that mutual aid is necessary because community works faster than government. Mutual aid because we're more effective than government because we keep ourselves safe, right? We keep us safe. And so I think it's kind of cool to see that the government isn't going to help those who can't afford food, so you see community kitchens. People can't afford housing, so people are figuring out how to house people. And what we said earlier about we need to fill in the gaps, and these are actually the policies that are keeping people safe. I think it's a beautiful thing to see that that's what we're trying to do. And, you know, in terms of actually tackling the government itself, the ACLU has committed to doing what they did the last term, right? They are committed to litigating. They're committed to defending protest rights, protecting, you know, the humanity of incarcerated people, stopping mass surveillance. And it's good to know that, you know, we have folks on our side too.
Yeah, fighting on all fronts. I was actually taking part of an event just last week here in California with the ACLU, who I'm currently an attorney with, and we're trying to create what's called a firewall of freedom in different states that allow for those protections to circumvent the abuses happening at the federal level. And the last Trump administration, the ACLU filed over 400 legal challenges, whether it's the Muslim ban or the border walls or different things. I mean, actually here in California, the state of California sued the last Trump administration over 100 times too, and was successful more than 2/3 of those lawsuits. And whether it's different things with the census manipulation or all sorts of issues. And last week we co-hosted an event with the California Legislative Black Caucus where it was surprising to hear some legislators say what you said about, you know, not using it in the form of mutual aid, but saying that we have to create these systems to protect ourselves in the event that this happens again, because we can't just be reactive all the time, but we as communities have to establish and create enough comfort, enough survival, food, housing, and just our own systems to protect us when changes in leadership happen.
So what do? It's been only a few days, a few weeks into this administration. And I think it's really easy to fall into despair, to get scared reading the news. But what you said, the fact that people are organizing, the fact that people are creating safeguards where we see there aren't any, I think it gives me just a little bit of hope. Maybe a little bit more than a little, but
no, we got to maintain hope. Hope is a discipline. But it's difficult when it's happening on so many fronts, right? Like we're just talking about the criminal legal system and things related to policing, but there's reproductive rights. I remember the last Trump administration, I think it was over 15 states where ACLU filed litigation just related to, you know, Roe versus Wade and the rollbacks there. Of course, immigrant rights, which we're going to have a whole episode devoted to. Was this administration is really on one in terms of trying to undo things that have been part of the American fabric for over 100 years, just birthright citizenship and other things. So, you know, the DEI, which, you know, inclusion should be a good thing, right?
Let's talk about that for a second. The rollback of DEI, not a lot of people are going to understand why that connects necessarily to law and order. I think people think DEI sometimes is some sort of corporate policy. That it doesn't, you know, it seems like a sort of concept that people don't realize they're benefiting from, right? And so I think it's important to note that when you mention DEI, that the opportunities that people have been given just because we've actually leveled out the playing field, the opportunities to thrive, the opportunities to make something of themselves, to enter, to burst through doors that were closed before, it has a huge impact on the social fabric that we live in, right? Creating less barriers between different socioeconomic groups. And, you know, you can make the connection down the line to law and order. And what we're going to see now is that gap get bigger again between the haves and the have-nots, the privileged and the non-privileged. And so the rollback of DEI very much is connected in its own way to law and order.
Very much so. And it's part of a long pattern, long history of this country of targeting certain groups. And there's always been affirmative action in this country, but it was usually for white men when they were the only ones who could vote, own land, hold office and different things. And we started to see some change into making America the actual country that the founding fathers said it would be in terms of equality, freedom, and different things now. But now you see attacks on those very fabrics. And they attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's attack on wokeness. You know, think about it. We're entering an era of American history where it's bad to be inclusive. It's bad to be of consciousness or be awake. And they want people to be asleep and non-inclusive. And that existed so much on the books in this country, like we mentioned the black codes and other laws, but now they're trying to return to this era.
Right, and to bring it back to the concept of law and order, that's kind of the easiest way to control people, right? And so I think it's incumbent on us to make sure that we're finding ways to keep those DEI practices alive, even if we're not calling it DEI.
Right.
Right. To sort of act on it, even if we don't speak about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you're seeing attacks on trans people, whether it's, a new executive order banning the service of trans people in the military, making it less safe for them. And that relates to, everything from mental health and well-being impacting people. So entire communities are being told that they don't have a space here, whether it's serving this country, whether it's, being a part of different things, and that we're entering that era now.
Right. And so when it comes to policing and it comes to this, I think people assume that has only to do with criminals, but really it's the criminalization of the culture of the U.S., the culture of communities of color. And so, again, we have to keep us safe. We keep us safe.
Exactly. And remain more vigilant, be more aware of your rights. And we're going to have a whole episode where we talk more about the Know Your Rights Camp app that covers some of your rights if you're stopped by police or dealing with immigration officers and different things. But it's also just not the awareness of those rights, but how you actually enact them, how you enforce them, because we know police violate rights. ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, violates rights all the time. Like those 15 Navajo Nation people they rounded up, their rights were violated. So we see this administration specifically has a practice of doing things that it knows is unconstitutional, that it knows violates the law, but it wants to be challenged. So, people have to be aware of their rights, but also know that in practice, those rights might not be respected, and you'll have to enforce them sometimes afterwards.
So finding the balance between knowing your rights and knowing your reality.
Exactly, knowing your reality.
And I think that's probably the best way to think about how to tackle this new administration. Yeah.
So that wraps up our first part of this conversation, but we know there are many more topics and many more actions to discuss.
So join us each week, because we will be definitely keeping up with what the administration is doing.
Follow us on knowyourrightscamp.org and on different social media platforms as well.
See you next time.